Achilles stands by his ships, agonizing over why Patroclus has not returned. Antilochus, Nestor's son, arrives and tells Achilles that Patroclus has fallen. Achilles falls, clawing the ground, and covers himself with ash and soot. The women of his house surround him in mourning, and he suddenly loosed a terrible, wrenching cry. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, hears him within the salt green depths and lets loose her own cry, as she is then surrounded by her sister sea nymphs. Thetis goes to her son, who tells her that Patroclus has died and that he's lost the will to live, except to seek revenge on Hector. Thetis confirms that Achilles' death will follow the death of Hector. Achilles sets aside his rage for Agamemnon in favor of his new rage against Hector. The armor of Achilles, however, is held by Hector. Thus Thetis leaves to ask Hephaestus, the god of fire, to make him a new set. Meanwhile, Hector has overtaken the Aeantes and was battling again for the corpse of Patroclus. Iris, the messenger goddess, goes to Achilles and encourages him to fight for the body of his friend. Achilles, always sensitive to the politics of the gods, asks Iris who sent her, and Iris tells him that Hera bids him now to fight. As Thetis told Achilles not to arm for battle until she returns, a compromise is struck. Achilles presents himself to the Trojans, and Athena grants him the storm shield of Zeus. Athena sets Achilles ablaze with a flame that reaches the sky, and Achilles and Athena let loose a war cry that sends unearthly panic throughout the Trojans. The Achaeans secure the body of Patroclus, and Achilles leads them in an all-night dirge. The book ends with Thetis asking Hephaestus to make a new set of armor for her son, and Hephaestus honoring her request.
Welcome to Ascend of the Great Books podcast. I am Adam Minihan here drinking a little bit of whatever is in my mug. Deacon, it's good to have you back.
Glad to be here.
And I am excited to hear, because you just read what happened in book 18, and we hear that Achilles, he suddenly loosened a terrible, wrenching cry. And before we started, you had mentioned that you were going to give a reenactment of this terrible, wrenching cry. So I'm really excited to hear how this goes.
Yeah, no. I have a different point. Okay, so I'm going to
pivot so hard.
This is not even a segue. I'm just going to, we're going to restart the episode. So I wanted to, thank you, Adam, for that lead in. I want to, welcome to Ascend, the Great Books podcast. So I want to kind of share this book. So one of the things that you and I have both been doing is that as we've kind of journeyed through the Iliad together, as we're kind of learning these perennial truths from Homer, both of us then have kind of taken these lessons into our own families.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that both of us have done is that we have then kind of found ways to talk about the Iliad with our eldest children, right? So my oldest is 9, yours is...
He's turning 10 this month, yeah.
Okay, very good. So 10. And so I just kind of wanted to share this. So if you have the video, you can kind of see the book that we're looking at. This is like
you just did that for 3 angles?
I did. All I did, because you have 3 cameras around there.
Do you think I'm going to actually cut to each one of those, like as you do that?
Listen, you need to do that media, because I just did that cool book move. And
that was a pretty sweet book move.
Thank you. Listen, we've already restarted this once. So anyway, so this is the Iliad. It's a 200-page graphic novel by Gareth Hines. It's available on Amazon. We are not sponsored by him. I just actually think it's a good book. And so I typically don't grab it.
He didn't even send it to us for free.
I actually bought it. I bought it myself. So anyway, I typically don't gravitate towards like a graphic novel, but this one is over 200 pages. It's very good. Here, look, I'm going to open this again. And so you can make all the video cuts. Look, here's this. Here's this. Here's behind me. Thank you, camera 3. And so it actually is beautifully illustrated. It is somewhat gory at times if you're sensitive to such things. But the text is very, very close to Homer, right? A lot of the language is very Homeric. I think I'm reading it. My eldest has already read it. We're rereading it again.
Dude, if your youngest has already read it, that is impressive.
Yeah, he's not learning to walk yet, but he understands the error of Achilles. So, she's read it, really enjoyed the narrative, and now we're reading it together because I think it is a very complicated tale. It's much more complicated than probably some of the other texts, that she reads. And so anyway, if you're kind of looking for a way to introduce the Iliad to your family or to your children, I actually think this is a pretty good take. So anyway.
Yeah, so the problem with this is that your child will most likely, like our children, not ours, like you and I having children, but
I think we followed. Yeah, go ahead.
Distinctions are important here. That they read the whole thing very quickly. They enjoy.
Yes.
They read it and they devour the story, right? And the problem is that 200 pages of a graphic novel is not the same thing or equivalent to 600 pages of
poetry.
What is this? Homer. Of Homer, right?
Sorry. We had a guy in our group, just as some context, we had a guy in our group who halfway through his explanation of whatever insight he had in the text, he's like, and that's what I think, and then he had to look at the front of the book and be like, Homer. Yeah. It's like, thank you for forgetting the author of the text.
And so anyway, so the child will end up spoiling things for you if you're not careful.
So right? Can you please tell? So I agree with you. My 9-year-old read the entire thing in one evening, could not stop. And then I started asking her a lot of questions about it. And so, I think that, the reading comprehension of a 9-year-old, and this is probably the most complicated text, that she's read. She's read longer ones like, the Redwall series, I think is very good, like these long novels. But this one, also being a graphic novel, one of the things that's actually very complicated that I think would be difficult to read is that it doesn't actually tell you who's speaking. So you actually have to memorize what each character looks like, which actually does have some maps, and it has a really interesting character introduction at the beginning to help you do that. But that was one thing I noticed is that, she tracked the general narrative really well, but then you've gotten to a lot of the specifics or like the character development or things like this, there was a little bit of struggle. And so what I've really been enjoying then is like, she devoured it in one evening and really enjoyed it, and you want to cultivate that love of the books. But now we're reading it together, and in reading it together, it's a much slower read, and then kind of asking a lot of questions like, well, what do you think about Agamemnon here? Like, is he being a good king, a bad king? Right? I mean, just like some basic moral questions and reading comprehension questions that I think are very good, and I've been impressed so far. Obviously, it's simplified in areas, but I've been impressed so far with this. Children's version tracking Homer pretty closely. But can you please tell the story of you giving this to your son before you've finished the Iliad? Oh wait, no, we can't do that. Because we have listeners that haven't finished it.
That's right. Yeah.
It's such a good story. Yeah. So just as a cautionary tale, if you have not finished the Iliad, do not buy your child a copy of the Iliad that they can read in one day and then come down to ask you, can you believe such and such happened? Right. Because you will be greatly disappointed as you eat your dinner.
What?
That was like the best series of texts I've received from you for a while. You're like, are you kidding me? This happens? I'm like, wait, are you reading ahead? What happened? No, my kid just came down and spoiled it. Nonchalantly, too.
Yeah, with no apology.
Oh, man. That was actually good. I forgot about that. That's actually really excellent.
So that's the danger that you have in there. But it is really good, yeah. And Haley just bought that for our children as well.
You bought this one?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, really? Good.
We have another one. I wish I would have brought it. I'll try to bring it next week.
Okay.
And it's also good. The art isn't as good as this one.
That's why I got this one because, again, I'm not overly tied to graphic novels, but I think cultivating their imagination is really important.
Right.
And the artwork in this one, while the strict literalists are not going to like it because it's not like the tassels and bright colors and the horns and some of the things. It's still kind of showing more classical Greek armor. But overall, the art is very good, how it depicts the gods. And I think it helps kind of till their imagination to actually tracking the narrative really well. The other one that you have, I bought that one too. I didn't bring it though. And that one has more of like that abstract art.
Right.
And I found it kind of really jarring to say like, hey, read this like classical tale, right? Read this like beginning of the great books. Like these are these perennial truths and goodness and truth and beauty. And then you juxtapose it with like this really ugly, I mean, to be quite frank, like this really ugly abstract art that even like my child opened up, because I gave her both at the same time.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Okay.
And she literally put that one away, was like, how did she phrase it? She said, I find this art distracting.
Huh.
And so I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to make you read it right now. Like read this one and then we'll read it together.
Yeah.
So very good. I just wanted to kind of mention that because I think it's a good text. And if you're looking for ways to kind of start incorporating the great books into your family, I think these are it. Some people might push back and say, well, aren't you going to spoil the story for them and they want to read it and like things like that? And I actually understand that approach. But at the same time, we don't do this with Bible stories.
No, and this is like 3,000 years old.
Right. Like sure, make that joke, but you also got it spoiled by your child. So, just to point out, like the last 2 minutes of conversation, like you also had this, text spoiled.
True.
So
very true.
All right, we have stuff to talk about.
Book 18, The Shield of Achilles.
Right.
My favorite book thus far. It opens up. I had a quick question for you. If
Already?
This is coincidence,
we haven't got in yet.
No, we haven't even gotten in yet. But I had a quick question for you. If this was coincidence or this was intentional by Homer, we see. Actually, will you just read the first sentence?
So the men fought on like a mass of whirling fire, as swift Antilochus raced the message towards Achilles.
Okay. So do you think that there's a connection here because swift Antilochus is used? It's not an epithet, I guess, but typically Achilles is known as like swift-footed, or his epithet is typically the great runner, or some kind of swift blank. Do you think that this was coincidental, or do you think that this was intentional by Homer that he uses swift here?
Well, the problem, with subscribing some type of intentionality is typically then you think that there's a reason, right? And so I'm hesitant to say, or I'm hesitant to deny that there's an intentionality there, simply because I don't see maybe the rationale behind it, right? So that sometimes you have to kind of be open and docile to such things. The swiftness, I think, on its face is simply tied to they chose him as the runner.
Right.
That's part of it, but they also mentioned that he was actually one of the favorites of Achilles, right? So there could be a connection there of, we could maybe see if that plays out in the text at all, of whether or not there's any kind of more parallels maybe between Antilochus and Achilles that then would make us take some of that vocabulary more seriously, right? So that was something that's interesting. I didn't pick up on that.
Maybe just something to track as we go.
Right. That's great. You made it in the second line before finding some esoteric lessons.
As I said last week, I'm known for my deep philosophical insights.
You're doing great.
Yes.
This is not a podcast for academics. This is a podcast like we talked about. This like what's on our heart, since hearts are a theme in 17 and 18. What's on our heart is to, I think, help the average person who's trying to come and understand the great books, right? And that's who we want to meet. That's who we want to accompany through these things. That's who we want to share that, the true teacher here is not me, it's not you, it's Homer, right? And that's who we're actually looking to help us through this. Okay, so we've made it to line 2, and you asked me a question, so now we're going to make it to line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
So here we go. We have opened up again, book 18, with language about hearts, right? And so it says, it opens with agonizing now. He probed his own great heart. And then if you look at line 24, right, which is right after he's told that Patroclus has fallen, we get this language again. A black cloud of grief came shrouding over Achilles. So can you kind of parse this out for us about this heart language, this grief language? We saw this in book 17. We're bringing it into book 18. What's going on with the heart of Achilles?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're curious on if you want me to pump out my answer, you can open up the valve, so to speak, of. I'm sorry, I don't have anything else to that. Like I was just trying to think of all the puns I could possibly think of with hearts.
That's
pump
good.
And valve is about as far as I got.
If you're a listener
can you do ventricle? Like how do you throw ventricle in there?
We're moving on. So if you're a listener and you appreciate Adam's puns, please reach out to him on Twitter because he gets no appreciation on the actual podcast.
But I'm just going to keep going. I'm just going to keep throwing them out there.
I basically just stare at you until you say something else and move on.
You do that, or you just continue to move on and gloss over it.
That's true.
Those are the two things.
Yeah, this is why we need to have guests on the show more often so someone can better appreciate your brilliance. Okay, so open up the valves.
Okay, so in book 17, we see that there's this dark heart of Hector, right? And so Homer speaks of the dark heart of Hector, and then like talks about how like the broken heart of Achilles here at the very beginning of book 18. So there's definitely a correlation or a bridge in which he's trying to make between the two. As a first time reader, it even caught my attention as the first time reader. I'm curious though, as one who has read it multiple times, has that take changed as you've read it, more than once?
No, I think the first time I read it, the first couple times I read it, I don't think I really picked up that there started to be a pattern of talking about hearts in 17 and 18, and
you did not?
No, I did not.
Oh, okay.
I think when I first read it. Which I probably read these very quickly, right? Because when you get into 17 and now 18, like the narrative's picking up, like we know we're moving towards like conclusions, right?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's only so many chapters, so many books in this in this book. There's 24, and we're on book 18.
So we're getting close to, wrapping up our, it actually kind of sounds kind of weird that we're getting close, the next month or so to actually wrapping up the Iliad. Halfway through the year of Homer. So no, the heart language really was kind of a later observation. It might be much more apparent to those who are paying maybe better attention than I am. And then particularly the linking between 17 and 18 on kind of now a lot of the language of the dark heart of Hector, the grief he suffers, the clouds, make a little bit more sense that we're kind of setting up, I don't know if it's a foreshadowing, but really we're kind of setting up that also Achilles is suffering, right, from this grief, and his is obviously more explicitly tied to Patroclus as well, but in a certain way also probably suffering it because of the gods, even though it might be self-induced because of the prayer of Thetis, but I do think there's a connection there. And I think if we kind of look at the heart of Achilles overall, maybe to pull a thread out of this, or maybe to say at this moment, maybe something to watch as we work through this, I think a question that is presented to us is as he has this black cloud and et cetera, and he's dealing now with this grief, he's dealing with the rage that he's had, to what degree how do we articulate him moving from a rage against Achilles to a rage against Hector? And what I mean by that is do we see a true forgiveness here? Is it a resolution? Is it simply a replacing of one thing to the other? We have a really important transition happening. It becomes more explicit and more public in book 19. But in book 18, right, he is starting to tell us, I am moving on, right? I'm done with this, right?
I had a quick question for you. And again, these are first time reading thoughts, right? So maybe this doesn't mean anything. Maybe this doesn't correlate at all. But I had this correlation because, old boy Nestor is my guy, right? So I'm reading this through a Nestor-colored lens. But there's a correlation, I think, or there's a possible one, and I haven't thought this out all the way through, but you have Nestor relaying information to King Agamemnon in the early parts of the Iliad, right? And relaying some heavy advice, relaying different things that have happened throughout the course of the book thus far, to give him advice, to give him counsel, to give him just an up-to-date, here's what's going on, right? Then you have Nestor's son doing the same thing to Achilles.
So is he playing that counsel role, right? Is that is that an extension of Nestor?
Correct. Yeah. It is kind of like a thought that I had. Again, I haven't read the whole book yet, or the whole the whole story yet. But that was just kind of like my first thought. Like, I wonder if there's this extension of Nestor happening in his son, and playing that role as well.
I mean, I think that's a great thought. I think that's a good thought that shows like engaging with the text and watching some of the ways that I think are subtle that Homer tries to actually teach us these things. Because in a lot of ways, the characters are really kind of analogs. I don't think the Iliad's like an allegory. But I do think that individually they stand as analogous to certain things, right? And Nestor certainly stands for wisdom, right? We talk about that. He's that linking of age and wisdom, which is kind of the most primordial understanding of wisdom, right? The older you are, the more wise you are.
Right.
So I really like that idea that then his sons, right, are they extension in some way, or maybe even some facet of wisdom itself? Here I would ask, and we need to get into this about the actual interaction between Antilochus and Achilles when he tells him. Here, I would say, like, do we actually see him providing any counsel, or is he really just like the bearer of news, and does he do that in a prudent way? I don't see him counseling Achilles per se, but there is something, though, about like, why is he the one chosen? One is being swift, but is Nestor's son not accidental? And he's also one of Achilles' favorites. No, I think that's a good question. I think it's maybe something to...
and I don't think he's actually providing counsel to Achilles himself, but he brings up interesting, it's very clear that as he's talking about this, he is worried that Achilles will not be able to control himself.
Yeah, so let's get into that, because that was one of the things that really stood out to me, and I think we had a good conversation with this with even our own Sunday Great Books, because people had a different read of this that I did not see. So I'll give my read of it, and then if you want to give the alternative, I think that would be helpful, because I did not see the alternative when I read it. So one of the things about Antilochus is that when he tells Achilles they're in the ground, right, they're weeping, all these things, it says, Antilochus kneeling near, weeping uncontrollably, clutched Achilles' hands as he wept his proud heart out. Which then you're kind of led to thinking like, oh, this is a deep sign of empathy, right? And then I love this line, for fear he would slash his throat with an iron blade. And the way I read this was that this is a commentary on the rage of Achilles, that it's Antilochus holding... kind of in a subtle way, holding Achilles' hands, worried that this character that embodies rage is going to literally kill the messenger, right? And we kind of, I guess my backup for that type of read would be, if you remember when Patroclus went to Nestor, so maybe there's a Nestor connection, right? When Patroclus went to Nestor, one of the things that Patroclus mentioned was that that Achilles, in his rage, does not make the distinction between friend and foe. Right, everything's consumed in that fire. So that's how I read it, and so I thought this is like, even Antilochus knows the rage that is Achilles, and he doesn't want to get slaughtered.
Yeah, and the counterpoint or the other view of this was, other read was, for fear he would slash his own throat with an iron blade. Well, whose throat are we talking about?
Well, it doesn't say own in the text, right? That's you. That would, for fear he would slash his throat.
Oh,
with
I
an
said
iron,
his own. I'm sorry. I gave it away.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That was
right.
That was.
But that's your. Yeah,
that
so
was a Freudian slip. Yeah. So for fear he would slash his throat with an iron blade. Whose throat is he talking about? Is he talking about Antilochus? Yes. Or is he talking about Achilles' own throat? Because it doesn't make a clear distinction here, and we actually looked up. This one, and then which one does Thomas Lackey have?
Fitzgerald's. Is it Fitzgerald?
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, Fitzgerald's, and both of them used just the pronoun,
right,
of his throat, not his own throat or anything like that. So.
I did not. I mean, it was maybe because I found it to be and still my gut reaction is that Achilles committing suicide would be somewhat contrary to his character, right? Because he's there for glory and dying on the battlefield and this immortality that comes through fame. I'm not against it, but it was just enjoyable to read it in a group. And one of the reasons you read it in a group is just because that read of it did not cross my mind at all. That Antilochus is holding his hands so Achilles does not slice his own throat
And
open.
say it's over.
Right. So anyway, just a good kind of diversity of how to read that.
One of the things that we like to do on the podcast also is, as we're talking about this, we hope that we spur questions. That you and I both, we make very clear that that Homer is the teacher, that we are the students, right? And so one thing that I asked in our Sunday Great Books group was what was the reasoning behind listing out all of the sea nymphs?
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like, is there a purpose in listing these out? And we didn't really come. I don't think. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Deacon. But like, we didn't come to an exact conclusion. We had a couple of theories, maybe, but we didn't come to a conclusion.
It reminded me a lot more of like Hesiod. Like if you've ever read his Theogony, he's like 150 years after Homer. He gives us this whole list of how the gods came to be, right? Genealogy of the gods. And this really reminded me of it because we really don't see Homer just doing this giant list like this. I don't know. I mean, certainly there's a parallel, right, between there's this cascading up. Well, I guess they're down in the sea, so down, whatever. But from mortal to immortal up, of this kind of parallel narrative of Achilles goes down, right? He's weeping and mourning. The women come and circle around him and mourn with him. Thetis hears. She lets her loose her cry. All of her sisters and sea nymphs come around her. So there's very clearly this kind of cascading mournfulness. There's also language of the hearts again, right? So she goes, this is a little after 70, she goes to see what grief has broken his heart. Around 85 or so, she asks him, what has touched your heart? And it's not clear to me, this is one of the things that we talked in the group, is that does she really not understand that Patroclus is dead? Right? Is she really coming up here just like raw on this, that like, hey, why are you crying out? Because she actually has a really interesting line a little bit before 90. She's saying, hey, tell me, what do you harbor deep inside you? Zeus has accomplished everything you wanted, just as you raised your hand and prayed that day. Right? All of the sons of Achaia are pinned against the ships, and all for want for you. They suffer shattering losses. So I didn't know, like, it's really interesting to say, like, is she really coming up not understanding that Patroclus has died? And even if she has, like, this is a really, I guess if she does, and she offers this to him, like, by the way, this is basically the impetus of your prayer. Right, you're reaping, right, that the harvest of what's going on right now is because of you asking me to go plead your case before Zeus, right? So I think this is a rich passage, and a lot of it is whether or not you think she actually does already know about Patroclus. Clearly, Achilles then, seems to tell her, right, Patroclus, the man I loved beyond all their comrades, loved as my own life. Right, basically has died, right? And also then the radiant gifts of the gods that had presented Peleus, which is the armor, is taken. And then he actually mentions her heart, within your heart as well, right? You must actually be, having this grief and sorrow and things like this. And then, as we kind of mentioned in our opening narrative, Thetis just kind of warning through her tears, so now she's also crying, you're doomed, right? Everyone's sad. You are doomed to a short life, my son, from all you say. For hard on the heels of Hector's death, your death must come at once. So Achilles, in a certain way, is going to precipitate his own death by going and seeking the death of Hector.
That's right.
So, his rage, I think, is in a lot of ways transferred. You see this at like 130 or so. Enough, let bygones be bygones. We've heard this before. Right? He said this to Patroclus. Done is done. Despite my anguish, I will beat it down, the fury mounting inside me, down by force. And now I'll go and meet that murderer head on, the Hector who destroyed the dearest life I know. We talked about this in our small group. I don't know anyone who reads this, and then we get into like his public kind of statement in book 19, which is almost verbatim this. that thinks that really there's any kind of actual resolution in Achilles' heart towards Agamemnon.
No.
Right? This is a transference of rage. Right?
Right. No, I agree, and I think that this Achilles knows that what he has to do, and decides he's going to have to do it, even though he knows it's going to accelerate his death. Right? Even though he knows that this is what's going to be the end. But ironically, this is something, and I was really wanting to look this up. And if you're a listener, and you're a Plato scholar at all, and help us out, tag us and let us know. But I remember when we read either Plato's Apology or Plato's Symposium or one of his dialogues,
in our small group.
In our
right?
small group, Plato talks about how this is what he admires about Achilles. Is that Achilles knows that what he has to do is going to accelerate his death, and he chooses to do it anyway. Now, I thought it was in an apology, but our buddy Thomas, who's been on our podcast before, he said he thought it was in Symposium. I didn't get a chance to look that up beforehand, but I think it is interesting that Socrates picks up, because Socrates, throughout his dialogues, is really questioning this, and we've talked about this before, but questioning, is Achilles really the virtue, the one that we all should be admiring towards or striving to be like?
Yeah, he's very critical of Homer as a poet.
Right.
As far as what has Homer actually taught the Greeks.
Right. And so, but I do recall him saying, of all things that, we can admire him for, we can admire him knowing that this is something that he has to do. He knows it's going to happen, yet he chooses to do it anyway.
Yeah, and I think you see some of this too, because around 143, 44 or so, we're still very much focused on glory, right? Mm-hmm. But now for the moment, let me seize great glory, right? So he's going to go out and kill Hector, but the ultimate goal still is that because he's kind of chosen to stay here in Troy, he's going to fight, he's going to achieve this immortal glory. He's going to achieve immortality through his fame, right? And that's actually something that, his heart desires. Before that, there's a line on 140 where he actually mentions Heracles, that's also Hercules, right? Not even Heracles fled his death for all his power, favorite son as he was to the father Zeus the king. Fate crushed him, right? Which is that's a phrase we need to keep in mind, because I think that actually comes back into the Iliad, right? That someone has actually been crushed by fate. And it's not incredibly explicit there, but there's also a little bit of a read there of is this again something where fate is something distinct from Zeus? So it's even though he was the favorite son of Zeus, right, fate crushed him, right?
Yeah, and we talked about this in the last book, right, with Hector and everything else.
Mm-hmm. And also with Sarpedon, right? Sarpedon would be
That's right.
Another one, the one I love the most.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's are you being crushed by fate again, right? And is that actually distinct? So Thetis responds to him. Obviously, the problem Achilles has now is that he wants to go fight, finally, but he has no armor, right? The only thing that actually is retained.
Oh, yeah, that whole, not having armor thing.
Right. So
He does have a spear.
Small problem.
He does have a spear.
He has a spear, which is important. His father's spear that only he can wield, which is kind of a narrative, I think, in Greek literature of having, weapons that only you can use because of your strength. So anyway, she goes to Hephaestus, the god of fire, right, the smith, to go and actually, get him some new armor. So then we're kind of back to...
quick question, is
go for
the
it.
smith, so it says the old man of the sea, so around, what is that, 165 or so. It says, Now down you go in the ocean's folding gulfs to visit Father's Hall, the old man of the sea. So he lives there in his father's hall, the old man of the sea. So the smith is of divine origin.
Yeah, Hephaestus?
Yes.
Yes.
Correct. Okay.
Yeah, he's the son of, I think you corrected me on this, the first or second podcast we had, right? So he's the son of Hera. He's somewhat supposed to be a parallel to Athena, right? Like a son that she gives birth to without someone else. And then I've seen it written both ways. Either he comes out and he has a birth defect, and so then she chunks him off the mountain,
right?
Or for whatever reason, she's not pleased with him, and because he's ugly, and she chunks him off the mountain, and then he gets a birth defect from falling off the mountain.
Right.
Either way, it's Thetis that then actually like nurses him, I'm pretty sure.
And the only reason why I bring that up is because in last chapter we talked about, or last book we talked about how Achilles' armor was made of divine origin.
Right.
And so she's replacing his armor with divine origin again.
Correct.
Which I think will play out as we continue going.
Correct. So then we're back to the body and fight for Patroclus's body, right? Mm-hmm. So then we get Iris comes, the messenger goddess, which, by the way, in classical mythology is really taken over by Hermes, but Iris is still the messenger goddess here. You know, basically...
Where are you?
This is a little bit before 200.
Okay. Yeah.
Right, so she's like, to arms, son of Peleus, most terrifying man alive, defend Patroclus. So, hey, what are you doing? You're sitting here. They're going to take Patroclus's body. I will say, as Achilles has many faults, one of the things he does do really well is he's very sensitive to the politics of the gods. Mm-hmm. And so here you notice that he pushes back on Iris, asking what god has sped you here. She answers Hera, right?
So did you, when he asked you that, there were two thoughts I had here.
Mm-hmm.
When he asked, immortal Harris, what god has sped you here to tell me this?
Mm-hmm.
Is he questioning authority? Or does he think that this is a trap, knowing that his fate is very present?
I don't know if it was I didn't take it as a question of authority. Well, insofar as like, is Iris telling him something that isn't backed by a god or something, right? I took it more as because the gods, are not monolithic, mm-hmm. then it's like, who sent you here, right? Because that actually informs greatly whether or not I'm going to listen to your message, mm-hmm. right? So like, okay, did Zeus just send you here?
So you think, or I think I kind of leant towards more like he wasn't sure if this was a trap or not.
Well, I don't think those two reads are competitive, right? Because who sent him,
right,
will say,
will determine,
whether or not this is a trap. But it's Hera who obviously wields a lot of authority mm-hmm. in Mount Olympus. And so then he's kind of stuck because Hera's telling him to go fight for the body. But then we kind of get this commentary that his mother told him not, to go out and battle, right, until mm-hmm. he actually has the armor. So he doesn't have anything else to do. So they come up with this compromise, which is just one of the most interesting passages. The first time I read this, I was like, what is this? And also, like, no one captures this in, like, Renaissance art, because like, what would this even look like? So basically they have this compromise that like, hey, Athena's going to give you the storm shield of Zeus, which if we were going to parse out, I think that is a very rich understanding that the actual storm shield of Zeus, who we've basically only seen wielded by Zeus, Athena, or Apollo, is now given to a mortal. That doesn't strike me as like a small detail. Mm-hmm. But anyway, and then they basically put this giant cloud around him, some fire. He goes up and stands on a hill, and then from his head, the blaze shot up to the sky. So his head is firing off this fire beam
what does that look
to
like?
the heavens. Yeah, like why is this not captured in any of like the artwork?
Yeah, I have no idea.
Right, I actually tried to find some.
Because it would look really weird.
It would look weird, right? But I think too, this is actually there is a passage earlier in which Diomedes has something very similar. It happens to him. It's a lot more subtle. But then this is his like obedience to the gods, where he's obeying Hera via Iris, but also obeying Thetis, and so he finds this compromise, which I think he is, quite savvy about these things.
What do you think about the 3 screams, 3 panics, and 12 of the finest fighters instantly dying?
Yeah, so that's a good point, because we didn't mention that in our narrative, that then when he gives this war cry, that 12 of their finest fighters of the Trojans die then and there, crushed by their chariots, impaled on their own spears. Yeah, you get a little bit of a numbers game, kind of like we saw the 3-4 mm-hmm. earlier. I'm not sure what to make of it, but it does seem that something is is structuring the text there.
Tag us on Twitter.
Yeah, someone out there is like, oh my gosh, they're not seeing that this is
They're
connected to
such
X, Y, and Z.
idiots.
So anyway, we welcome your commentary. So anyway, what I would say overall, I think maybe to push a little deeper into this is that I do think what we're seeing here too is Achilles becoming more godlike. And this is a thesis that I think has to be thrown out, that as Achilles moves back into the war and also moves back closer to his own death, I think he's going to take on more and more godlike traits.
Like a deification?
Yeah, there's like this deification of him overall. I think this kind of began, part of this I think began with the rage with Antilochus holding his hands. Because you remember, right, when Patroclus talks about him as not, in his rage, he will not make the distinction between friend and foe. Later in the text, that type of analysis, that type of description is also used for Zeus, right? Actually, it occurs to me now that it's actually when Zeus gives his strict decree and Ares is just going to go, defy it. Athena tells him, like, if you do this, you'll put him into a rage and he will not make a distinction between who obeyed him and who didn't. He will just beat us all.
Right.
And so I actually think that we're starting, and then you see Achilles now, and he's holding the storm shield, and he's letting out these cries like Athena is, and he's seeing this kind of godlike power. Like, I think to watch the deification of Achilles is a theme that we should probably be tracking.
Okay.
Right? And also in the Iliad with Homer's pantheon, that does not mean that he becomes a better person. Right? That's probably something to clarify. All right. So then we get probably one of the most tragic, fatalistic kind of dialogues in the Iliad, where Polydamas, who I think has been pointed out, plays kind of the Trojan Nestor role in certain ways.
Typically speaks first.
Yeah, he's giving advice, etc. Basically, he's like, we need to retreat. Mm-hmm. Like, we need to pull back. Like, that's Achilles. He's got fire blazing out of his head going over the sky.
He brings up good points.
Right. Just, I've observed some subtleties here that we should probably get out of here.
12 of our best just died.
And so, he gives this advice, and Hector rejects him.
Yeah.
And, so basically the idea is, do we return to Troy, or do we kind of camp out here on the fields again and continue the war? And I think that a lot of times this is seen, you kind of asked some questions about, is him putting on the armor the beginning of the end? I think there's good arguments for why that's yes. I think by this point, him not listening to Polydamas and staying out there is very clearly one of the most fatal errors of Hector, right? To not take this advice. And I think that if I was going to give a defense of Hector, which again is my want on certain things, I think there's two things going on here. One is that I think he still very much thinks that he is blessed by Zeus. And because of how the armor worked out, I'm not sure if there's any reason to say that he shouldn't think that. So around 340, I think he's saying, Polydamas, you are asking me to retreat while I have the favor of Zeus, and I have the capacity here to maybe actually crush them against their ships, to maybe end the war. And so he just doesn't, I think, because is he being prideful? Is he saying, I can do this, I can defeat Achilles? Like, what's he doing? I think to give him the benefit of the doubt, I think he still thinks that he is blessed by Zeus and he's here to get glory by the ships. And so the question is, like, is Hector even thinking clearly as he makes this mistake? And then what's much more explicit is that down on like 361, the Trojans are not thinking clearly. Athena actually explicitly comes in and robs them of their senses. And so they're applauding Hector's ruinous tactics. So Homer gives us a lot of commentary here, right? That these are ruinous tactics, and none to Polydamas, who gave them sound advice, right? So then they settled down on the plain while the Argives raised Patroclus's dirge all night long.
Yeah, I think that 361 to 365 or whatever was very telling, because up until this point, right, I took actually, and I'm not always the guy who is giving Hector the benefit of the doubt, right? Mm-hmm. But from 330 to 360, I was feeling good. Like I felt for Hector.
Right.
I had like a heart for Hector here because here he is. He's the leader. He's the leader, and he's saying like, listen, our city used to be of rich gold and rich bronze, but now our houses are stripped. And it's like we cannot sit here like the luxury of having what we used to have based off of our fathers and our forefathers that have given us is no longer. Mm-hmm. And we have to get up and start fighting. It is time to do something. And so he was a man of action here, in my opinion. Like he made the decision, even if it's not necessarily the right decision. I see Hector a lot of times like waffling a lot and not making a strong decision one way or the other. And as a leader, you have to be confident. And when you make a decision and say like, this is the reason why I'm doing it, even though I've heard you out, this is the reason why I'm doing it. We should move forward and be confident in doing so.
Right.
And so as I was reading this, I was like, okay. I thought after Polydamas like gave his speech, and he was very concerned about Achilles, and he was and you came back saying, you as in Hector saying like he's very confident that Achilles cannot breach the walls of Troy, and that like no, we're gonna move forward. I thought, okay, hey, listen. I can get behind this Hector. I can do I can do this. And then Homer ruins it. Because then he says that Hector's ruinous tactics, none to Polydamas, who gave them sound advice. So I actually had a soft spot in my heart for Hector here because I appreciated his leadership, even if he necessarily wasn't correct. Because we have the benefit of knowing the outcome of all of this, right? And so he does not. It's not like he has the benefit of the doubt. And like you said, he thought that the gods were with him here. And he was being a leader that we have criticized him in the past for not being.
Yeah, I mean he's very decisive, right? And I think you have a sensitivity there to the fact that returning to Troy is a death trap.
Right.
Right. We're running low on supplies. Right. We're running thin.
Right.
Like I think the gods have favored me now. Like if we return, like it's a death trap. Mm-hmm. Like we'll never actually make it back out. But then Homer comes in and, which is I think somewhat rare for him, comes in and gives some pretty clear commentary on where this was. And I think this is a hinge moment in the text, right? And we'll kind of see that not necessarily in 19, but 20 in the rest of the book. We're going to be looking back to this decision of saying is not returning to the walls, right?
But you can see why he thinks that.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to argue with you. I mean, I think that I'm always going to enjoy a pro Hector, pro Hector read there. But I do think it's a hinge moment. I do think it's a fatalistic moment. Okay, so to kind of actually speaking of fatalism, so if you look at like 380. So this is the this is Achilles, right? And he's talking to his Myrmidons. Mm-hmm. Just a side note, like he tells them that he will die, which I think is like the first time he starts sharing this narrative.
Yeah, I will never voyage home again.
Yeah.
Never.
So I just kind of as a side note, because he's also working through his own fate, right? Hector kind of understands the fate of Troy. He understands that where his fate's going to lie. Now Achilles understands his fate. And so a lot of things are kind of moving in to their crux. Now, let's look at 390. Okay. So he says, he's talking to Patroclus. So a little bit above this, he says, but now Patroclus, since I will follow you underneath the ground, I shall not bury you. No, not till I drag back here the gear and head of Hector, who slaughtered you, my friend, great-hearted friend. Here in front of your flaming pyre, I'll cut the throats of a dozen sons of Troy in all their shining glory, venting my rage on them for your destruction. So one, we've talked about the rage of Achilles and whether he's really beat it down or really he just transferred it. I think it's quite clear he's transferred it, right? Two, though, and this is again one of those like short statements that I think we really have to understand the impact of. Human sacrifice returns back to the narrative of the Iliad, right? So this is not to be clear, like this is not I'm going to go slaughter the Trojans in the field of battle, right? That's one consideration. This is, I'm going to take 12 prisoners of war, bring them back to your funeral pyre, and I will ritualistically slaughter them, which is also going to include some animals and some other things that will happen during this ritual. And so human sacrifice returns to the narrative of the Iliad. And as a reminder, why we say returns, as you might remember on a previous episode, we talked about towards the very, very, very beginning, right, that one of the narratives that happens prior to the beginning of the Iliad is that the Achaean force is stuck on the island. They can't get off the island because I think one of them killed like the sacred bunny of Artemis, right? Yeah. And Artemis just casually tells them like, well, the only way I'm going to give you the right winds to blow you to Troy is you have to sacrifice the daughter of Agamemnon, who, it should be noted here, was lured then to the island by saying that she was going to be able to marry Achilles, right? And then Agamemnon actually agrees to her. Actually, she shows up, right, at the altar, if you will, to be married, and she's actually then sacrificed. And
He's
then
the worst.
Yeah, and Artemis says, congratulations, you can go on to Troy. So just kind of where Agamemnon is in his family relationships. But
also like his whole wife, that whole situation.
Right. He also says that he enjoys his slave girl more than his wife. So Agamemnon's family relationships play a little bit in the beginning, and then will actually play a lot as we move into the Odyssey.
There's some damaged goods.
There's some questions to be answered. So anyway, again, just kind of flagging that now, again, in this rage, we're getting at least a promise now. We'll see if it plays out, but a promise of human sacrifice. So we get Thetis goes to Hephaestus' house. Let's see. Yes, so 460, my memory did serve. Thetis saved my life when the mortal pain came on me. After my great fall, thanks to my mother's will, that brazen bitch, she wanted to hide me because I was a cripple. So here in this narrative, he's crippled at birth, and she's ashamed of him, and then she chunks him off the mountain. Thetis is the one that takes care of him. There's another narrative, which you helped us understand, I think, on one of our first podcasts, that then at one point, that's when he's like hanging Hera from her ankles with like anvils tied to her. Do you remember this narrative? And Hephaestus tries to like intervene for his mother, which I thought was kind of interesting given their relationship. And then Zeus also chunks him off the mountain. So there's been some. Hephaestus has a rough life. It's also rough to be immortal and be crippled.
He has some mother and father wounds.
They all do on Mount Olympus, right? So anyway, the narrative here, the takeaway is that Hephaestus owes Thetis, right? So when she shows up, there's this warm hospitality, right? I think we should probably keep in mind guest friendship as we go through this. And so Hephaestus is, it's really kind of a thick narrative. It's laid on pretty thick. Right? He's welcoming her and saying everything that she did for him, and he's like, so I must do all I can to pay her back for the life that she saved, right? Quickly set before her her stranger's generous fare, which is a comment of guest friendship. So this is really laid on, and then Hephaestus is like, oh, what do you want? And then she cries, and then she basically asks him, right, for new armor, so Achilles can actually go out and do these things. And she actually gives like a brief summary of what's happened. The smith, right, Hephaestus says, fine, I'll do this. And then we get into one of the most debated, fascinating passages of the entire Iliad, which is the shield of Achilles. So he's making this armor, and so Hephaestus makes a great and massive shield. And so this is like 565 or so. And so actually I'm going to pull up our guide, because on our guide I've parsed out all the different parts of the shield, which I think is important. And
which you can get on our website, ascendthegreatbookspodcast.com.
Right. Or just thegreatbookspodcast.com. Right?
We have both.
Just whatever your heart desires. So
we're relativists.
No, we're not. We are not. That would be false. So let's see here. What book are we on? 18? Okay, good. So yeah, how should we interpret the shield of Achilles? So let me just kind of, this starts at like 565, right, or so. And in parsing these out, there are many different, if you get online, you look at different guides, commentaries, there's many ways to parse them out. I have probably erred on making distinctions, right? So the shield starts, what happens is that as Homer's describing the shield starts in the center, the description of the shield, and then it works its way out in concentric circles, right? Until you get to the very edge of the shield. And so basically, Hephaestus is imprinting this image onto the shield that I think, like, as you read these things, it seems very clearly something is happening, right? So let me kind of just maybe map out what's on the shield, and then we'll kind of go through them and maybe give some like insights or observations that we have on each one. So the beginning starts with, so the very center of the shield is the earth, the sky, the sea, the sun, and the moon, right? This very cosmic imagery. Mm-hmm. And then it has, either with it or around it, the constellations, mm-hmm. and those, several of them are named. Then you kind of get this very famous depiction of the two cities, and what may be called the city at peace and the city at war. So immediately, I think everyone can realize that Homer is inviting us that there are contrasts and juxtapositions that are being presented on the shield, right? Correct. That actually are part of this narrative. So the city at peace has basically two parts in it. One is a wedding feast, so mm-hmm. we see a marriage occurring, and that's at like 573. And then that shifts into what might be a little confusing at first because it talks about a market and there's a dispute. But really what we're seeing is in this market, they go before a judge. And so this is actually a court of justice, right? So there's actually a conflict. So if the marriage is, coming together, now we get this conflict that's going to have this resolution. And so we get a wedding feast, a court of justice. And then we shift into the city at war, this different city. And the city is under siege. And then you get a raid by the besieged. So the city that is under siege kind of sends out an attacking force, a marauding force, to then attack a convoy of those that are sieging them, right? Then we move into some very pastoral imagery. So we get the plowing of a field, and that is coupled with the harvesting of the field, mm-hmm. right? Which seems to be, obviously there's a lot of harmony there. We then get a vineyard, what you want to call like a vineyard festival. What I mean by that is like, yes, it's a vineyard, but then there's also music, there's dancing, right? There's boys and girls. Like there's more than just the vineyard itself. Then we get a narrative of cattle under attack. So this is we're at like 670, where you get the shepherds, they have cattle, and they're attacked by lions, and there's this effort to try and save the cattle, which ultimately is unsuccessful. Mm-hmm. And then we get the flock in a meadow of peace, very short, just like, hey, here's a meadow, and the flock's fine, and everything's doing well. And then we get a circle of dancing, but it's also very much in the context of courtship, right? There's boys and girls, beauties, right, that are dancing, and so it's very much in the context of courtship. And then the very edge of the shield, so we come to the end of the imagery, is Ocean's River, which is really the boundary of what is known, right? Which I think lends itself a lot to what the shield actually represents, that the very rim of the shield is the boundaries of reality, right? Is the boundary of what is actually known by man, right? We don't know what's past Ocean's River. So any kind of so maybe going back to the top, looking at the earth, the sky, the sea, the sun, the moon, etc. Anything that kind of stands out with you on like these first couple parts of the shield?
Yeah, because there's no God, there's no gods.
Yeah,
specific. Now, and remember, Hephaestus is like bitter because he was thrown off. Mm-hmm. And so it would seem fitting that a divine person, or divine, however you want, divine thing or whatever, right, would incorporate some kind of divine aspect at in the middle.
Yeah, I had a similar read that it was interesting that particularly in this whole narrative, right, like the Iliad opens up with like the will of Zeus is what's actually animating all of this. Mm-hmm. It is interesting to me that like Zeus does not play the center role of the shield, because I think maybe we should take a step back and give out a thesis that I think the shield is a commentary on the cosmos, right, of an ordered whole. of civilization. And this is inside this cosmos, inside the civilization, there are certain things that are in balance and certain things that kind of play off one another. And I think this is a deeply, deeply Greek philosophical concept that we'll see then very much be picked up by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, that the world is ordered, that it's knowable, right? That things have a purpose, that you sow, you reap, right? Things of this nature. And so, yeah, I do think that then if you kind of return, so if that's our broad commentary, that this shield is a commentary on the cosmos, a depiction of civilization within that cosmos, it is interesting that Zeus doesn't play like a central role in the shield.
Yeah, I could actually understand why he wouldn't necessarily put Zeus as the center, because he's bitter, right? He's bitter that he got thrown out of Olympus.
Yeah, you could make that argument. Yeah,
but I still think that it doesn't preclude, or it doesn't make sense that he wouldn't have some type of divine aspect in the center.
Yeah, because actually, or really anywhere.
Right.
I mean, where's the only place that we actually even see any gods?
Do
you remember? The only time I can remember seeing any gods in the entire narrative of the Shield is actually at the City of War. Right? So, like, if you look at like the City of Peace, it's
590 something.
It's a 6, like 25 or so. Strife and havoc.
That's
Plunged
right.
in a fight, the violent death. Now, if you're not tracking right now with the text, strife, havoc, death, these are all personified, right? So that's one thing too, I think, is your commentary of like, where are the gods in this? Not only is there not maybe Zeus at the center, or maybe you might think like one of the rings, circles would be like maybe Mount Olympus or something like that, right? That like, do they not create civilization and like this like cosmic ordering? And then you couple maybe that missed expectation with then the only mentioning of any gods is actually at the City of War, right? Ares and Athena are also mentioned as well at the along with like strife and havoc. So there's a lot there that like, wait, are the gods agents of order or are they agents of chaos?
Right.
Right. And what is Hephaestus Homer through Hephaestus, trying to maybe comment to that? I think you could push back maybe on the earth, sky, sea, sun, moon. One of the things that I was curious about is, now they're not in the Fagel's translation, they're not capitalized, but earth is Gaia, right? The sky is Uranus. So it's like, are these the cosmic gods? I'm ignoring you. Like, are these cosmic gods, like the more original, gods or not? It doesn't seem that way. Right. But also like, even if you look at, like someone like Hesiod, who will place like the earth, Tartarus, love, some of these things that are more primordial gods, there's still the sun and the moon, which are not part of those as well. So it does seem like we're more talking about the cosmic bodies than any kind of deity. At least that's, I don't see the evidence for reading them as deities. So again, we don't see the role of the gods in the shield, I think, is a big question, right? And why then are the only gods that we have contextualized, at the City of War? Any thoughts on the City of Peace?
No, not off the top of my head.
I think it's interesting that that these two things kind of go together. So a wedding is right. There's a joining, right? This like harmony, right? The husband and wife, coming together, and then the justice is a conflict resolution, right? So you've got like, we have harmony, and then how do we handle our discord, right? Okay, well, there's a marriage feast, right? We have this kind of love, right? I think love and justice really characterize the City of Peace, and there's probably a lot that can be kind of dug out there to understand what is actually going on. But then the other one is that there's a conflict where the City of Peace is actually not free from conflict, but it actually has a way to resolve this, right?
Justice, yeah.
And I think too, it actually talks about justice being somewhat sacred, right? Where they actually come and they dispense justice. There's this sacred circle. It's not an explicit thing to the gods, but there's something divine about the fact that they can resolve this conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So then you obviously have a clear parallels with the city of war, right? These are meant to be played off one another.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard not to think of Troy, right? It's
Right.
a city besieged, right? So we have Troy, or a Troy-like city, I should say. It is a little counterintuitive to me that it's the city that's under siege that sends out the raiding party, right? To actually get with the convoy. But then again, we got this kind of like very violent battle that occurs. And again, this is the only time that we actually see these gods, mentioned. And I think that's something to think about like what is the actual role of the gods. Plowing the field and harvest, right? I think these are pretty straightforward. I would like to think more about why the harvest narrative is also then coupled with a kingly narrative. Like it doesn't seem like there's a king in the middle of the forest. Like if you read the harvest narrative, and there in the midst, the king, scepter in hand at the head of the reaping rows, stood tall in silence, rejoicing in his heart. So it's interesting, and maybe this lends into it being a commentary on civilization, that then when the laborers go to actually have the harvest, there's also this kingly presence there, right? Actually rejoicing in his heart about the fruits of their labor.
Yeah, because isn't he the one like with the silos and things like that? Like as they put the harvest into the silos into like storage, he's the one that has the keys to all of that anyway.
I mean, yeah, that could be true. I mean, so I think there's more there that I'd like to think about of like that kingly narrative. Stood out to me when I read that because it's not just pastoral, right? All of a sudden we have this like agricultural language, but then all of a sudden there's king standing there. So then we get the vineyard. As I said, this is a vineyard, but it's music, it's boys and girls dancing together, right? These types of things.
Yeah.
This very much reminds me. To me, it's a very Dionysian theme. So if you remember Dionysus, right, the god, this kind of jovial wine god, right, very much in the
amusement,
right,
amuses.
It's true, right. So the etymology, right, of these things being pulled from the muses. So to me, it's very Dionysian with its wine, with its undertones of eros, right, with the boys and the girls. This music, Dionysus is. He's still very jovial in the Homeric period, right? He's not this, for those who are familiar, right? He's not this overly brutal person that he is in, say, like the later classical era of like the Bacchae and things like this, where he's almost, he is, very somewhat inhuman in his madness that he brings upon humanity. Here still is that very kind of just jovial wine god, right? The wine is the greatest gift that he gives to humanity. The cattle under attack is an interesting narrative because it's a complicated narrative. So you have a herd of cattle, and then they're like trying to protect the cattle, and they're attacked by lions. They rush to help, but it's no use. And the lions, right, the hounds actually shrink away from them, and the lions then are feasting upon the cattle. It's hard not to think of a parallel to the city of war, right? It's hard not to think of Troy. Right, that they're trying to fight off these lions, but ultimately they're ineffective. They're afraid.
Right.
In the lions,
the danger, the duty, the violence that they bring. Yes.
So to me, it seems like there's a lot of parallels here, and not just with. I think there's also parallels with the Dionysian narrative, which has this very festive, playful side, and then you get a very dutiful side with the herdsman, right, and violence and things like this. We have a very short 3-lined meadow, right? Everything's at peace. There's flocks grazing. The shepherds are, everyone's at peace again. You get the dance. As I mentioned, again, we go back into the beauties, the young boys, the girls. This is another courtship, eros kind of narrative, right, that we have. And then it ends with the river, which is that boundary of the world. And if I'm allowed to skip ahead.
Oh, no.
I know, which I probably shouldn't do because then I'm not going to find it and be justly punished for trying to skip ahead. So I guess I won't. But we'll find, I think it's in the next book, in book 19, it actually does give us a quick commentary on Ocean's River, that it really does stand for the boundaries of like human knowledge, if that makes sense, right? So I think that, I think it's a wonderful, the Shield of Achilles. I mean, I think there's many things to bring into there. I think broadly it's a commentary on the cosmos, a commentary on civilization. It's probably arguably the most explicit philosophical passage in the Iliad. As me as a first-time reader, first time just tracking the narrative, I just remember kind of hitting this like a wall. Like all of a sudden, wait, whoa. Like it made me slow down and be like, wait, what is Homer actually trying to, teach us here? That then I think is very much inherited by the Greek tradition, that the cosmos, the civilization, is ordered and set inside an ordered cosmos, and all things have their place in a certain order that brings harmony. You're going to get a lot of philosophical commentary on that from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, right? So...
Yeah, no, I agree. This is the first book, I believe, that I intentionally reread almost immediately after I finished it.
Really?
Yeah, so let me give you just a brief, like, Adam Minihan, here's kind of what I thought through this. And I have no, I don't have backing for it. This is just kind of my own personal thoughts, right? So I'm throwing it out there. Feel free to blast me on Twitter or whatever you'd like to do. Saying that I'm wrong. Because as I was reading this, I read this the first time, just as we kind of walked through it, right? Trying to understand, okay, and I was like, I luckily went online and like found the shield like depicted as an image. And so like, as I was reading it, I was tracking, going, from in to out, understanding, the narrative. I reread it again. And so here's kind of a thought that I had was that most of the time when men make shields, they put something ferocious, they put something very intimidating, either a godlike figure or a lion or a bear or some type of a deity of some sort on a shield in honor of them, Apollo, things like that. When the mortals do that, they have, they typically do that with their shields. It's interesting that Achilles, who had a divine origin shield, replacing it with a divine origin shield, Achilles himself, who is part divine, has a shield not of the mighty Zeus, not of the god of war, not of him hearkening as being one of the best warriors of all time, which I think would be epic. To be the hubris of having yourself on your own shield would be pretty
right.
epic. Or two lion heads coming out or something like that. No, that's not what was made for him. The shield that was made for him depicted ordinary life. And so you have so what does this mean? Like it's almost like when you're mortal, you're striving to be you're defending the divine. The divine. You're that's your shield. That's your guard. And then you have a man who's kind of a divine man, and he's defending the natural order. He's defending the polis. He's defending. Just the ordinary man, so to speak. And that's what he's fighting for. And then it's interesting that I didn't get a chance to do a whole lot of research on this, but there's only it's only five ply deep on his shield, right? I think
you mean the layers of
the layers of the shield, right? I think if you look at about 560, it talks about how it's about 5 ply deep. Well, we know that that's not the deepest, the thickest shield, right? Ajax's shield is much thicker. I think even Hector's is thicker. So it's just interesting that there's these inverses of what you would think it would be. Here's a divine origin shield. You would think it'd be the thickest, it'd be the biggest, the baddest, the toughest. It's made of gold. It talks about how it's made of gold in here, and that gold is represented as divine a lot of times. Yet gold is terrible for defenses.
Right.
Right. Like you put up a gold shield and then throw bronze or a bronze tip at it and see what happens.
Right.
It's going to shatter, or it's going to go right through. So I don't know. As I reread this, I thought it was very interesting how the shield that Achilles is given from divine origin to Achilles, who is somewhat divine, is him supposed to be guarding the ordinary.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot there to unpack. I think that if you take it as a commentary on the cosmos, on civilization, that's fine, great. But I think to your question is, well, why does Hephaestus do that, right? What's the intentionality?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why, I think what you're digging into is like, okay, well, why does Achilles particularly carry such a shield?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do we find Achilles to be like this well-ordered cosmic person that's in balance?
No.
Like, no. So, what is it? I think that's a great question. Like, what is it? It is contrary, I think, to what we normally see, right? So you have like, you have a shield and like the head of the Gorgon like is on it, right? This Medusa dragon character, right?
And remember, sorry, because I don't want to lose this thought, but like, remember Achilles left intentionally the ordinary life, knowing he had the opportunity. Like he had the two choices, right? You can live this ordinary life.
Yeah, no, I think that might be one of the keys here is that does the shield represent in a certain way the two fates of Achilles? Mm-hmm. And does he then, like he's bearing the shield of not something that he represents as a whole, but something that he then kind of as like maybe an analog to mankind chose, right, to have like immortal fame, right, or immortality through his fame and his glory, as opposed to having immortality through having children, right, where your name is eventually lost, but your line goes on, right? Because both of these things, and this becomes more explicit later with Plato in his Symposium, but both of these things are actually seeking of a certain type of immortality, right? And so does his shield then, that kind of has like the city of war, the city of peace, like these pastoral scenes, the justice, marriage, Eros does play a large part of the shield. It comes in twice, right? Both with the marriage and then with the dancing. And that's not including actually the Dionysian scene, depending on how you read that. So yes, no, I think you are bringing up something quite astute, which is, can you link the shield with Achilles through the decision of the two fates, right? And is that why Hephaestus is giving it to him, right? That he kind of understands this narrative, I guess, through Thetis. Because other than that, it doesn't seem to lend itself to our understanding of Achilles, right? Where's the peaceful meadow for Achilles? Where's like the marriage feast for Achilles? And maybe it's
very inverse.
Yeah, so maybe we tack that up to the life he chose to walk away from, right? That's a good. I mean, I think it's certainly worth thinking about. I
also want to as we're kind of wrapping up Book 18, I think that it. I kind of bashed Homer earlier in the earlier books, right? I thought that I think I even said at one time I thought it was poor writing in some aspects.
Which you've repented of. Which
I have repented of. Right. Yet I still I have a struggle with it. I've repented of, but here I think is some brilliant writing. I loved Book 18. Because here Achilles as soon as he finds out that Patroclus dies, he didn't actually need this armor, right? Like he can go out there naked with a spear and just go out there and just kill Hector, right? Like
you think so?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, he knows. I mean, it would only make his fate quicker, but he could definitely do it. But Homer says, no, let's take a break. He takes a break from this climactic moment of Book 17, which builds up this anxiety, or not anxiety, but this anticipation that will happen in Book 19, but gives this really deep understanding of what is happening as he's getting new armor and providing this philosophical aspect. of like, what does this actually mean by him taking on this new armor? What does this actually mean of him like actually listening to the gods and like being obedient to them? That's kind of something to take note of. And so I think that it's really good writing to build up the anticipation of what comes in book 19. I broke down book 18 into 6 parts.
Huh.
And I'm open to being corrected here. But I really took a deep dive, or not a deep dive, but I really took a lot of joy in reading 18. And so like I was really trying my best to parse some of this out. And so I broke it down into like the mourning of Achilles, of recovering Patroclus's body, of Hector in the Trojan assembly, of lamenting over Patroclus's corpse, of Thetis visiting her visit to
Hephaestus.
I almost said hepatitis. That
I wish you just would have leaned right into that. That would have coughed me out. Go on.
And then the description and the divinity of the shield and armor that was made, which I'm not very good at breaking out and breaking up into the different books, so to speak. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. That was just something that I.
What's your first section?
The mourning of Achilles, Achilles mourning basically Patroclus, and
yeah, he's waiting. It's just when you parse things out like that, it's my suspicion, probably from studying the Old Testament, is whether or not there's any kind of internal parallels there, right? That kind of chiastic structure of, A, B, C, B, A, right? Which is, and probably reading also too much Plato, in which there's, always some kind of esoteric structure, I think, that's informing the text. Yeah, that would be that's interesting. I love the fact that you did a deep dive there. It sounds like you did that a lot because it sounded like for you saw that Achilles' character was undergoing some type of like development in the text. I guess one question, kind of maybe piggybacking on your insights, is does Achilles then learn anything from the shield?
Right, which
would be a question I would have. That if he's literally receiving this commentary on the cosmos from Hephaestus, right, does then the fire god's lessons give him anything?
Yeah,
right.
I think that's a very fair question.
Right, or you could go very esoteric that the answer is no, because he's always going to hold that image away from him. Right. So then the question is,
he's already chose it.
Right. So the question then is like, I guess, what then do people learn looking at him? Right. If anything, or can you learn anything because you're seeing a commentary on the cosmos while then facing down this inhuman rage monster?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So, very good.
That's all I have for book 18. I don't know, but actually,
I only just parsed it out and broke it down, and
yeah,
that's great.
But I really again, book 18 has been my favorite book. It's the first one that I finished and then said I really want to reread this. I just thought it was really brilliant writing from Homer. I thought that it really helped the story from one climactic moment, building a bridge to the next climactic moment, while building anticipation, while giving philosophical insights. Whether or not Achilles actually takes it or not is a different question. But yeah,
that's good.
I really liked it.
It is a good. I'm looking at the guide real fast to see if we missed anything. I don't think so. I think we went very deep, which I think I appreciate. Because I think it's when you read that, I really appreciate your almost zeal for it, because I think this is a book 18, that you are almost hit over the head with. Wait, there are deeper things going on, right? And I need to kind of stop and see if I can, somewhat parse them out. And it's then it's something that I think invited me when I read the Iliad again to say, well, if Homer has the capacity to offer this much of a philosophical concept in such really a short period, is his depth not also informing the rest of the Iliad, right? But am I losing that because I'm still tracking the narrative and stuff like that? So I think this is really an invitation to a deeper read of the Iliad as a whole, right? Okay, very good. Well, next week is book 19.
Boom.
The Champion Arms for Battle, which has one of my favorite scenes, maybe for comedic reasons, in which Achilles and Agamemnon try and make nice with each other in front of the entire Argive army, and is kind of wonderful to see.
I'm really glad it was public.
Yes, really good to see how that works, or maybe it doesn't work. And so we'll get into book 19. You can check out thegreatbookspodcast.com, and we have the guides, we have other resources, and very kind of happy to partner with everyone and read through this year of Homer.
There's a couple of people who've been reaching out asking, like, how can we help, right? Like, I want to support, things of that nature. Really, the best way to support it is to provide reviews, like rate and review our podcast to help us. So that's free. That doesn't take you, it just takes you about 30, 45 seconds to rate and review our podcast. But then also to share it. I mean, if like the whole purpose, or one of the purposes of having this whole thing, is so that way hopefully you will be enticed to have a get men together to read these great books, to talk about them. So share this podcast with your family and friends.
Very good. Thank you, Adam.
Hey, we'll see you next week.